Hello, welcome. Beautiful day outside. Thanks for taking this opportunity to join us. We have a special program today here at the History Center. I'm Bob Blackburn, Executive Director of the Oklahoma Historical Society. And what we're doing today is having a conversation about women in journalism, both broadcast and print. And this really is a reflection of the exhibit that we did last year at the Pioneer Woman Museum in Ponca City. Larry Odell, who is over here, was the curator of that exhibit, and a lot of our staff worked on that. And we did so many interviews with women who have been prominent in print journalism and broadcast journalism, and we started finding some themes in this entire story. And we did the exhibit. We had a roundtable discussion there. We said, we've got to do this again. We are recording this today. It will air on KGOU, we know for sure. We probably will use parts of this in a new exhibit coming up. This is not an end or terminal project. We are doing a new exhibit called Crossroads of Commerce, History of Free Enterprise in Oklahoma. And it will deal with economic development of the state, and 2 of the 22 themes will be newspapers and broadcast. And we will look at the business side of both industries, and these experiences, these stories will be part of that exhibit as well. That will open in November of 2015. Well, we're so privileged today to have 5 women who have been prominent in journalism through the years. And let me provide just a little overview biographical sketch as we go. And so starting here closest to me, Sue Hale began working for the Oklahoma City Times in 1975. In 1991, as assistant managing editor of the Oklahoman, she coordinated the move from a downtown building to new offices in a suburban location. 5 years later, Sue was trusted with the launch of a new initiative called Connect Oklahoma. With that project online, she was named executive editor of the Oklahoman. Next, Vivian Vahlberg, raised in Oklahoma City. Vivian became the Oklahoman's Washington, D.C. correspondent in 1971. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan swore Vivian in as the first female president of the prestigious National Press Club. She later became the executive director of the Society of Professional Journalists. Pam Olson. In 1976, Pam became the Oklahoma City market's first primetime female anchor for KW-TV. She left Oklahoma City to join CBS News, covering the southeastern United States. In 1982, Pam relocated to CNN and worked as the White House correspondent, and in 1985 became congressional correspondent. Linda Cavanaugh. Linda's first job was at KOCO-TV in Oklahoma City, where she landed the morning anchor job 3 weeks after she was hired. In 1977, after a short stint in Washington, D.C., she joined the WKY news team, and within 2 years was weekday anchor. She has been with the station, renamed KFOR, ever since. Jenifer Reynolds started her career on KOSU radio station while attending college at Oklahoma State University. She moved to television in 1988 as KW-TV Channel 9's primary Capitol reporter. In 1990, she was offered an anchor job at the station. Since leaving the anchor's desk, Jenifer serves as co-host of the statewide television show Discover Oklahoma. Well, one reason we are here today in Oklahoma City is that this is a partnership program of the Dead Center Film Festival. And this afternoon, and again on Sunday, a film will air at the Dead Center. And it is a documentary that we co-sponsored with the Inasmuch Foundation. Bob Ross, the president of the Inasmuch, is with us today to produce a documentary on the life of Edith Gaylord, a pioneer broadcast journalist and leader in the community. And that film, I think, will impress a lot of people when it's shown. I have seen it. It will be adapted for our exhibit in Ponca City on women in journalism. It will be shown other venues around the country. And we're here today to celebrate the life and career and the legacy of Edith Gaylord. So to start the conversation today, and this will be fairly free form, I will have a few questions to begin, but it will take its own life here as we go, as you will see. But I'd like to start with a question for Vivian. Vivian knew Edith Gaylord, and we would like to start off with the memories of Edith, her spirit, her dedication to journalism, to open records, to telling the public what is going on in government, in the community, and providing kind of a spirit that should energize all of us. Vivian, when did you meet Mrs. Gaylord, and some of those early years in your memories?
I came to the Washington Bureau of the Daily Oklahoman in 1971, and pretty quickly that year met Edith, who would come up particularly for the Gridiron show every year, and was a good friend of the Cromleys, my bureau chief Al Cromley, and his wife Marion. And so I would meet Edith at that time, and it was very clear that she was different in spirit than the other Gaylords and in political views. And she I had also heard so much about Edith from before I got there, when during World War II, then she and a number of women became journalists in Washington to cover the Capitol while the men were at war. And I always heard impressive things about her. The neat thing is that now, after she's gone, she donated money to create 2 foundations, and I've been affiliated with one, the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation, where over the years since she created it, we've given $44 million to really good journalism programs and projects around the country. So it's kind of nice to have known her, from my early days in Washington, and to be kind of carrying out her legacy. Sue Hale can probably tell you more about those specific questions, because she knows all of those things better than I do.
And Sue, if you would, tell us how the foundation is really carrying on the work that was important to Edith.
Well, Edith was very direct, and she was very interested in ethics. She was very interested in accuracy and in journalism. And today, as you know, the world has changed tremendously. And I think she'd be very proud of how we're moving forward and connecting people with the correct websites on the internet. I don't know how many of you have seen the commercial of, oh, well, it's got to be true, it's on the internet, which would set Edith's teeth on edge as it does mine. But she was an amazing advocate for First Amendment, for really getting women educated, and she was a fabulous mentor. And I actually didn't meet her until I came back to the Times, to the Oklahoman in 1984. And from then on, we became really good friends, because she would come to me and say, okay, I really like that story. Here's another thought about another angle. And I'm going, whoa, okay, I didn't even think about that. Or when I did something that she really liked, she would say, that was a great story. I really like that story. And when I would say thank you, she would say, you don't need to say thank you, that's the facts. Mm-hmm. And it was, at first, it kind of took me aback, and so I had to practice not saying thank you. But I think today, she would be really, really proud of what the foundation has accomplished to this point, and the directions that we're going, and how we have mentored many of the nonprofit investigative groups who we really do look at them for, are they accurate? Are they transparent? Do they publish their ethical codes? Do they really meet the standards that Edith set?
Following with the theme of mentors, if Pam, Linda, and Jenifer can answer this, early in your career, and it doesn't have to be but someone who inspired you in terms of journalism, who did you want to emulate? You said that person gets it. I want to be like that. Who might that have been?
Before I answer that, I want to make one comment about Edith Gaylord. I never had the opportunity to meet her, but on one of my very first days when I showed up at the CNN bureau in Atlanta, in Washington, one of the first questions that was asked of me was from Fran Lewin, who worked for the Associated Press at the same time that Edith Gaylord worked for the AP. They were peers, they were colleagues, and probably competitors. And I just always remembered, she asked me, well, you've met Edith, haven't you? And I had not, I was embarrassed to say. And from Fran had such wonderful things to say about Edith, and was so disappointed that I had not yet had the opportunity. But I always remember that. Going back to your question, Bob, this was back, I guess, in the 70s and the 60s, and there weren't very many women in journalism and television news at that time. I suppose that I was influenced by Marlene Sanders and Pauline Fredrickson, the latter of whom covered the UN, I believe, for about 21 years. And then Marlene Sanders, of course, she had an afternoon news program for 5 minutes called News with the Women's Touch. And on local television, I was certainly influenced by Ida B., who is here today, who ought to be up here on the stage. Seems like you could have had some connections with somebody to get your way up here. But Ida, would you stand? I mean, this lady has been an icon in Oklahoma City television. And she obviously had many dreams, many aspirations, and she fulfilled them, I'm sure, and there were limitations. There were limits to what she could do. So not unlike a lot of the other women on local TV news, she did have her show, the Ida B. Show, and of course, would they give her full name? No, it's Ida B. But she did a wonderful job. I'm sure she influenced many of those who have had careers in TV news. Even though she wasn't specifically in news, she covered the news in a different way. She added to the social fabric of the community. And a mutual friend of ours, again, Lola Hall, who was the weather girl at Channel 9. David Grant was the weather man, but Lola Hall was the weather girl. And then, of course, another early woman in television was Miss Fran from Storyland. But all of those women did tremendous jobs. They did what they were allowed to do based on the social customs and restrictions of the time. But certainly each of them added something to the fabric of my life, and inspiring me to what I eventually hope to do.
Interject there, because I was thinking about Lola Hall. I grew up in Oklahoma City, and I remember when Lola Hall became the weather girl, and I remember people saying, well, would they take the weather as seriously from a woman as from a man? She doesn't have as much authority, and they certainly wouldn't have countenanced the idea of women in news on air at the time, but the idea that somehow your weather wouldn't be as credible from a girl. I think it's one of those barometers of maybe everything hasn't changed, but some things really have, thank goodness.
Linda?
Well, it's been an interesting ride, to say the least. Channel 4 just celebrated its 65th anniversary. And it was interesting because a lot of the folks who were on the air when we first went on the air 65 years ago came to this reunion that we had. And one lady stood out in particular. Her name was Jane Hall. And she was on the air when Channel 4 went on the air June 6, 1949. And she came to our reunion. She's still a dynamo. But it was interesting because she was on the air only 2 months. And I said, well, why were you on the air only 2 months? And she said, because I got pregnant, and you didn't put pregnant women on the air. So it was a whole different social landscape and a whole different social stratus that you were working with back then. And as far as admiring anyone, when I grew up, truthfully, there weren't people on the air for us to admire. Barbara Walters was the first one that sticks in my mind, but I never grew up wanting to be a television news anchor. It never even occurred to me. I thought I'd be a teacher like my dad. And I was lucky enough to get a Gridiron scholarship to the University of Oklahoma, and I thought, well, gosh, if they're going to give me some money to study journalism, why not? So I did, and that's truthfully how I got into journalism. It was just as simple as that. And I started at Channel 5, And I interned at 4 for a while. It was called an internship, although there was really no formal internship. I just went up there and said, will you give me a job? And they said, well, we can't give you a job if you don't have any experience. And I said, I won't give you any experience if you don't give me a job. So they said, well, just come and show up. So I did. Got no pay. Did that for about 6 months. And then an opening came up at 5. And I went over there and thoroughly enjoyed it. And within a couple of weeks, the guy who was doing the morning show kind of disappeared. And there was no one else in the newsroom, and so I got it. So my qualifications really aren't that great across the board. But it was a delightful time. And I remember one other time when the sports guy didn't show up, and they said, well, will you do the sports? And I said, sure. I didn't know any better. I was so naive and stupid. I just did anything they told me to do. And so I did the sports, and the phones lit up. People said, what is a female doing giving the sports? You know, and I said, I guess I'm not going to do that again, huh? And they said, well, maybe not for a while. So that was kind of the start of that. Yeah.
Jennifer?
You know, probably my first role model in journalism was my dad, Jim Campbell. He's my stepdad who raised me, and he's a member of the Oklahoma Journalism Hall of Fame, so he was obviously a great role model for me. But I wanted to be a print reporter. It never occurred to me to do broadcasting because, quite frankly, he always felt that broadcast journalism was a contradiction in terms. So I really wanted to be a print reporter, and I studied four foreign languages in high school and college because I was going to travel the world and be a print reporter. And as it turned out, I have, other than being at OSU, never lived more than a mile off of Hefner Road in my entire adult life. So, I did have, there was somebody I kind of looked up to in the Oklahoma City broadcast industry when I was in high school, actually. I had watched her on air, and we were agitating for some things at the Oklahoma City School Board, and this reporter came out to interview us. And I was so impressed with her and the camera and all of that it made me think, well, that might be kind of a fun job. And so I've always kind of looked up to her. Her name was Pam Olson. So anyway, so Pam was one of my mentors, or not mentors, but one of my role models as well. And mostly I kind of ended up in it. Decided not to do journalism because I read a statistic that said it at that time, which was about 1978, there were 40% more journalism graduates every year than there were jobs filled or vacant in the field. And so I thought, well, how impractical. So then I studied social geography for a while and thought I'd do East Asian studies, which is really quite practical. And and after 3 or 4 or 5 different major changes, I decided to get a job as a secretary, and because I could do that and work for a little while and figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And I ended up at KOSU Radio as a secretary and worked, and ended up one day I said to the news director, there was some kid doing the newscast at noon, and I said, you know what, I could do a better job than that, like right now today with no classes. And he said, so the next day he came and he said, hey, that kid's sick, you want to do the news? And so that's how I started. And that was my first day, and I walked into the newsroom, and I don't know if you've ever actually taken little baby ducks that have never been in the water and put them in and they just take off swimming and they're so happy, and that's how I felt. I just walked into the newsroom and thought, for the first time in my life, okay, this is what I want to do, and that's how I ended up in journalism, in broadcast journalism.
If I might ask another question, and just go down the line here. Sue, you start. But, you know, each of us, as we start our writing career, writing for either broadcast or print, and we do a piece and we say, I really got it that time, I nailed it, and you had your name on it, either on air or in print. What was that first story that sticks in your mind as you go down the line? And tell us a little bit about that story.
Well, it was, actually I nailed the story, but it was really traumatic. I was working at the Winfield Daily Courier, and I had managed to talk the managing editor into letting me cover City Hall. And so one of the city councilmen made a comment about housing that was entirely wrong. And I did a whole bunch of research, and in those days, you know, research meant you went to house to house to house, you talked to people, you found out all the details, and that was the research. And I spent a long time on that story, and I came back to the newsroom, and I showed it to the managing editor, and he said, okay. He said, you sure of this? And I said, I have 3 sources, and I am 100% sure this is a perfect story. I have nailed this story. And he said, okay, fine. And oh my gosh, we ran the story. In those days, hate mail came in the mail and visits, and the councilman said I ruined his life. And I'm a kid, I'm getting really emotional about it, but I knew I was right. I knew I had it right, and I thought, I'm not backing off of this. This is what I want to show people, that you're going to have to take the good and the bad if you're going to be a journalist. You're going to have to really prove that you can do it, and you can prove it one way or another, and I did it. I won't lie, I went in the bathroom and cried because I felt really bad that maybe I did ruin somebody's life. But in the end, I knew I was right. And I thought, if you're right and you've checked it out, and it was something that I began telling reporters as I started working with reporters, if you know you're right and you've got all the sources, don't back down.
Good lesson. Vivian, how about your first story that you're proud of or remember?
Well, I don't know that it was the first. It was probably a ways in, but I was really happy with the story I did about Carl Albert when he was Speaker, because it was at a time that there were all sorts of fights in the House of Representatives in the Congress. And Albert had been unhappy about something the Oklahoma had written and said, you don't know how hard I work. You should follow me around. And I said, okay. And so, so I had a couple of days in which basically I followed him everywhere except the bathroom, to all the closed meetings, to, just watched his whole day and watched how he handled it, and was on the inside of all these things, and then wrote a profile, which ran in the Oklahoman and the Washington Star. And it really captured a moment in time of someone who reached one of the highest pinnacles in Washington, a job he had dreamed of. But by the time he got there, number one, the world had changed, and speakers could not be as powerful as they were in the time he was coming up in the House. And number two, at one point he said, I think I'm just getting too old for this job, that it was so hard and so nonstop. And I really felt with that profile that in a kind of a full-bodied way, I captured the reality of Carl Albert at that time.
Pam?
I'm going to mention a couple of stories, okay? Each of you has triggered a memory. I'll try to make it quick. I don't have any one profound, overwhelming moment, but all of my stories, I thought, I got excited, I think, about all the stories I did. I started as the editor of the church youth newspaper at First Baptist Midwest City. It was called The Minor Prophet. Great. I thought it was so exciting. I would type it up on Friday evenings, mimeograph it, run off the copies on Saturday, and then distribute it on Sunday morning. You mentioned winning the Gridiron Fellowship. That was, and maybe it still is going on, but that was a big, big deal at the time. I was the MCHS correspondent for the Times at that time. That would have been, and that was the ultimate prize that you got. I was named Best Feature Writer and received a very nice dictionary from the Oklahoman Times, which I still have. And I'm just almost positive it was a story on a coffee house in Midwest City. And if you can think of all the worst cliches in the world that you can imagine, someone new writing a story about a coffee house. And the line was, something's brewing in Midwest City and it's more than coffee, which is the worst, But anyway, that was the story that got Best Feature Writer. Then one more quick comment. You mentioned Carl Albert. I covered the House for several years for CNN, and I will always remember the kindness and generosity of House Speaker Tip O'Neill. He was a wonderful person. CNN was so new at the time. The equipment was going, because CNN is going on 24/7. The equipment always needed to be maintained. We were always pushing it harder than anyone else had ever pushed equipment. It was never repaired and maintained as it should have been. And one of my jobs was to interview the speaker after the State of the Union address in Statuary Hall. I did that for several years, and then Jim Wright, and the equipment always broke down, it seemed like. It was always, never once did he lose his temper. Never once. He was always so kind and understanding. and other speakers were not. But you mentioned that about Carl Albert, and I had to throw that in about the late speaker, Tip O'Neill.
I'm kind of like Pam. I can't think of one that really stands out in my mind to begin with as the best story I ever did where you felt like you really nailed it. But it seems like there have been several where when you were finished, you thought, I'm glad I did that. I think it made a difference. And so that's what, to me, nailed something. And one of those was a documentary we did called Strangers in Their Own Land. And having grown up in Oklahoma and my dad was a school teacher, and one of his fellow school teachers was married to a Native American. And through her, I could see all these things that were happening in their cultures that really weren't being made public. It was kind of a secret thing because they weren't too inclined to let other peoples into this culture. So for a year, Tony Stizza, a photojournalist, and I delved into this culture and put together an hour documentary that I felt made a difference in Oklahoma because the response we received from Native American tribes and from the Native Americans themselves, and even from the rest of the population of Oklahoma, was we never knew that. And the Indians, when they would write, would say, for the first time I feel proud of who I am. And so I thought that was one that I felt like we really nailed it. And I also learned in doing that you can never take yourself seriously. Because in one of these situations, we had been told that if somebody asked you to dance at a powwow, you need to dance. And I respected that, and I was at a powwow, and we were in Stroud, and an older gentleman came up and he said, would you dance? I said, I will be happy to dance, but please understand, I don't have any rhythm. I'm a horrible dancer. He said, that's fine, just follow this girl in front of you, just do what she does. And so I said, okay. So the drums started out, and we were in this huge arena, and there were only 3 people in front of me. One was this Indian princess who he told me, just follow her. And so I've got my eyes on her, and there are probably 300, 400 people behind us. And so the drums start, and she starts walking, and she's walking like this, and the drum beats, and she kind of dips a little bit. And so I walk around this arena with her, behind her, watching her dipping as she dips for probably 12, 13 minutes, because it was a long song. And so it's over, and she gets ready to leave, and she turns around to shake my hand, and I shake her hand, and I shake the hand of the gentleman who had asked me, and then she walks off like this. She's got a broken leg. And I didn't know it because she had on full leggings all the way up. So I had limped around the arena right there with her. I was so proud of myself.
Where was that?
Oh gosh, 1992, maybe 91, something like that. Yeah, it was a while.
That's a great story.
Jennifer?
Oh, that's beautiful. And that story did make such a difference. I remember watching it. When I was at Channel 9, and I would been there about a year and a half, and I'd spent 3 years at KOSU and 3 years at WKY, and I was fairly new in television reporting. And the longer you are someplace, the more clout you get in terms of what stories that, for a while you get kind of the balloon launches and the groundbreakings, and then eventually they figure out you can do something and you'll start getting a little better stories. But we were, at that point, TV stations have research in the field all the time. And we had a consultant that was telling us that the big psychographic hot buttons of those days that would get people to watch were these drug stories we were doing, and we'd done several of them. It was the beginning of the no-knock warrants, where the police officers didn't have to announce themselves. They could just get a warrant and crash through the door and then say, we're the police. And we were going in with them, and I don't, whether that was good or bad for America, I won't argue, but it made really great television, and we had done several of them, and the public had responded, and the ratings were great. And so our police beat reporter had done several of those, and the consultants really wanted another one. But he said, we've done every drug there is, there's nothing left. And so the producers suggested, well, maybe crank, let's try crank. And he went to the police department, and the Oklahoma City Police said, there's really no story there. We don't arrest anybody doing crank. So Dave said, I won't do that story, so they made me do it. And I said, well, why do if your drug guy says there's no story here, why do I have to do it? Well, we need to do it. It's a psychographic hot button. So they had me do this story. Well, it turns out, actually, the story wasn't use, the story was manufacture. And I called Paul Renfro at OSBI, and he said, oh, this is a great story. And he said, we've had this huge upsurge in lab seizures, because the OSBI chemical guys worked all of them. And he said, we don't know why exactly, but it's a big story. These chemicals are dangerous. And so we put together a series called Speed and Greed, and we really followed up on what was going on. And ultimately, we determined that this was in June, and in March, the federal government had made it illegal to sell precursor chemicals to make methamphetamine, but the federal government, through the Drug Enforcement Administration, was still making those chemicals available out of one of its storefronts in Tulsa. And so the reason we'd had this big upswing in lab seizures was because the DEA was putting the chemicals on our streets in Oklahoma. And so we went undercover, we busted them doing it, we presented our information, we put it on the air, and eventually the Dallas, the head of the region, apologized to the citizens of Oklahoma on camera because it had been such a bad deal. And what was so rewarding about it, and it was a fun story to do in the sense that we were so terrible undercover. We called ourselves Miami Vice. We called ourselves Miami Vice because that's where I'm from, and Miami, Oklahoma. And so we had to go in twice to make the buy. They thought we hadn't made it, so they were a little bit cocky. But we did go in the second time, and we were able to buy it. And so we kind of busted their chops. And to have the DEA, when you can get a federal agency nail them that hard and that specifically, that they can't worm out of it, and they actually will apologize to you on camera, you really feel that you've nailed it. And the next year, our lab seizures went from 80-something that year to 2 or 3 the next year, so we knew that we had really had an impact. That was probably my favorite story, and I never won a single award for it, because the same year, my friend Terry Watkins had done a story on railroad safety, railroad crossing safety, and they got this great shot of a school bus going through in the arm of the railroad gate coming down on top of the bus. And she beat me everywhere. That darn Terry Watkins. Yeah, so, but I always felt that I think it was probably the best thing, in my mind, was the best thing I ever did.
Jennifer, keep the mic, and we'll come back the other direction with this question. Each of you as pioneers probably were in a situation at some point where you felt like you were breaking into the boys' club. Maybe a little pushback, maybe just a little discomfort. But is there a memory about, hey, we are breaking some barriers here, and the glass ceiling is still there, but we're not going to give up?
You know, I have to say, I think most of these women kind of leveled the playing field for me. I never had so much of that. I felt, oddly, in the field, being a female reporter, a field reporter, was almost of benefit, because men still were 95% of the newsmakers that I was covering were men. And I always felt men were a little bit more comfortable talking to a woman. There's always, if you don't know, a man is very comfortable saying, well, little lady, let me tell you what happened. And so, I would sometimes do an interview, and another really great reporter, a guy, would come along after me and interview that same person, and we'd compare notes later to say, hey, he didn't tell me that. And so I always felt, to some extent, it made it a little easier. The other thing that helped me in the field, though, was the 2 years I spent at KOSU being a secretary. And because that's where I experienced discrimination. Good God. I mean, people would just talk past you. It was as if you didn't exist. And I still remember a guy coming in one day and going, excuse me, may I speak to the man in charge? And I said, well, I've got several men in charge. Could you tell me maybe what you want to know, and I'll try to find you the right man in charge? I just need to talk to the man in charge. So I got up and I walked him into the general manager's office and said, this man would like to speak to the man in charge. So by the time I got back to my desk, my station manager, he comes right back with him because he needed something from our public files, which I maintained. And so he said, well, this is Jenifer Reynolds. You need to talk to her. She can help you. And he said, and next time, instead of asking for the man in charge, maybe you should ask for the woman who knows where things are. So having been a secretary, what helped me the most out in the field was that I was really careful to be nice to secretaries, because I knew what that was like. And so when I got to the Capitol, the very first day, I went in and crashed down at Jim Barker's office, and he had a brand new receptionist, and we were commiserating about the fact that neither one of us knew what we were doing, because it was my first day covering the Capitol. And we were always great friends, and she always got me in to see the speaker. And it was the best. I didn't do it for that reason, but I had so many friends who were secretaries, and a lot of reporters never figured that out, and especially the men, that it wasn't, Jim Barker didn't decide who got to see him. Kathy did, and Bob Macy didn't decide who came in to see him. Jane did. So, you would call and you would talk to the administrative assistant. And so the discrimination that I experienced was really more as a secretary, and it became a great benefit to me as I became a reporter.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Linda?
When you worked at Channel 4, when I started, you were more than a reporter. You had to be a photographer, too. I mean, it was a one-man band. You took your own cameras out, you shot the stories, you came back, you edited it on film, you ran it up to the projector, and you got it on the air.
Carried the film cans?
Yeah, yeah. But there was a belief, and I can remember this at the time, that women really weren't capable of doing the job when we went to sound cameras, because they were larger. You know, if you're just shooting a little Bell and Hale 16 millimeter, it wasn't that big a deal, just a little old film camera. But when you went to sound, the cameras were much larger and weighed more. And the argument was women aren't physically able to do this. Now, they were physically able to hold a 40-pound child and carry that child around, but they couldn't hold a 40-pound camera. So that was one thing that sticks in. That's right. And so did my camera.
Video.
That's right. But I can remember the day they called me in the office and they said, we have this experiment we're thinking about. And I said, what is that? And he said, we're thinking about going to a co-anchor. I said, to do what? He said, well, the news, the main newscast. And I said, well, that's interesting. And they said, we'd like for you to do it. And he said, but we don't know how long it's going to last. You know, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. And that's been about 35 years, so I guess it worked. But I can remember that I went home and I told Will, they don't think this is going to last. And so we started banking my paycheck so that we could live on his.
And you got fired?
In case I got fired, exactly. In case this didn't work out. And so we've got a little nest egg now.
All right. Pam?
I'm going to respond to a couple of things that all of you have touched on. You talked about the internships at Channel 5 and 4. Probably the best thing that ever happened to me was when I was at OU, and because they really, I started OU in 1968, and I was a journalism major, and I was in the radio, TV, film curriculum. And I remember it as if it were yesterday, my advisor, Bruce Henson, gathering us there together, saying, we're so glad to have you. This is the brand new curriculum for radio, TV journalists. But we don't have any equipment, really. We don't have any sound cameras. We have Bell and Howell's. Ned Hockman has a couple of sound cameras, but he uses them to film OU football games and to film his movies. Well, I never saw a sound camera at OU because Ned Hockman, and I dearly love the late Ned, and if you knew him, you will understand, he was always filming. OU football had the priority. So OU established a tremendous internship with Channel 9 in Oklahoma City. And I, too, at one time tried to get an internship at Channel 5 and did it, before then, it was very brief. There was nothing structured or very formal in place at the time. And there were two men who co-anchored the news, Hickok Halbert Report, and one of them said he was so pessimistic, and he said there would be no future for women in TV news because their voices had carried no authority, they were not credible, and no one would trust them. And so there really was not that much for me to do there, and the opportunities were not there. But so anyway, move forward to OU. And so to fulfill part of our curriculum requirements for the journalism, radio, TV curriculum, as I said, we were farmed out to Channel 9. They had a fabulous, fabulous internship program. This was about 1970, 71. Some of you might remember Andrew Fisher, who had been brought in from somewhere. He had been brought in from New York. He had brought in some tremendous people who had a different way of doing things. The hour-long newscast had been instituted just a short time earlier. I will have to figure out what year that was, but I was there 71 on, and it had been started within the past year and a half. And so the bottom line was, there was a huge volume. There was a huge appetite for news. You always need more news to go on an hour-long newscast than what you think. And so we still had the Bell and Howell cameras, the interns, but we were out shooting film. We had to edit it ourselves and get it on the air. But it was an opportunity for us because it allowed the professional reporters, those who were more experienced, time to do the packaged report. So it was a win-win situation for everyone. They had always had lots of fresh news. We were getting enormous experience that we would not have gotten at OU or at another TV station. And that leads us to the talk about the FCC in the early 70s. I was there as an intern, and there were the rumblings from the FCC that they were going to soon order the radio stations, the TV stations and radio stations, they were going to force them because of many complaints that were going to force them to hire more women and minorities. And so I was very much at the right place at the right time, and I continued to go in every day, postponing my graduation from OU because I wanted to be one of the ones there when the FCC came and said, you're going to have to hire more women and minorities if you want to retain your license. And so I was hired then I started part-time, I guess, about 71. And then several years later, there was still pressure from the FCC. And Mr. DeLear, I have to say, was a wonderful, tremendous person. He was an extraordinary general manager. I don't think he's ever gotten the credit that he should have gotten for all of the wonderful changes, all the wonderful things he did at Channel 9, because Channel 9 was the first hour-long newscast. They were the first to have the electronic news gathering, the first black reporter anchoring the news, Tom Daniels, because of his graciousness. He selected me. It sounds so hokey, I know, at the time to even talk about these things. But he offered me the opportunity to be the first woman to co-anchor a broadcast in the Oklahoma City market. And I remember one news reporter in the newsroom. He was a Capitol, the Capitol correspondents are all cynical, all jaded. We were going also live from the Capitol, and maybe when you were still there, Jenifer, at one time there were 2 live shots. There were two reporters at the Capitol on a daily basis to cover the news live from the Capitol. But anyway, one Capitol reporter complained to the others that the newsroom was going to hell, because Pam was co-anchoring, but it survived.
Vivian, any the pushback from the boys' club?
Well, when the press club admitted women, and they took 2 votes. One was to admit us. The second one was whether the newly admitted women members could be admitted to the members' bar or the card room, the inner sanctums. And fortunately, and that was a split vote. That was, a big split vote was that some of them wanted to kind of admit us. Well, anyway, after the vote, a number of women went into the bar, and the bartender hands a woman a drink and says, "Here's your drink. I hope you choke on it." Then there was a time when I finally got to be president of the press club. I got all sorts of interesting opportunities coming up, including the Men's Dinner Club of Oklahoma City invited me to speak to them. And I thought, well, this is interesting. And so I asked my editor at the time, Jim Standard, "Hey, Jim, you have any advice on what I should say to the Men's Dinner Club?" Jim says, "Oh, Viv," he says, "it won't matter after you jump out of the cake." So, but he was always a big supporter. I think that, and he really was. He had a great sense of humor. But I think the other thing that I experienced was mostly, 2 things. Underestimation, the idea that, well, you weren't really serious and you were going to go away, and, that maybe what you did was frivolous, and that was pervasive, kind of the sense of, well, you're not really a serious part of the community. And I would remember sitting in press club meetings saying something and people would ignore it, and then a man would say the same thing. They'd talk about his idea all night. And it was just like you weren't heard or you weren't seen. And I particularly noticed that in management. And, when you think about a good outfit will start grooming who they want to be their managers. I don't think anybody ever thought of me to be groomed to be an editor. And in hindsight, if I were to do my career over again, I would have been smart about it and made sure that they groomed me to be an editor. But I was told that even though I had been Washington correspondent for a number of years, and Al Cromley and I really split everything in the bureau, and I did a great job, and I always assumed that if Al retired that I would be bureau chief. And someone told me later, he said, it was not until you were president of the press club that it even occurred to anyone at the Oklahoman that they thought that you could be bureau chief. And I was just shocked because I thought it was kind of always assumed, but it took a long time for people to see women in that light. And now Sue, of course, did it, so.
Sue?
Well, I think my favorite story is, and I have several, but not so many in Oklahoma. But when I was working at the Topeka Capital Journal, I came there. I'd already had the experience of covering City Hall and police and fire and all of those things. But of course, I started in the women's department. But I went to the managing editor, and I said, I really want to be a City Hall reporter. And they said, well, we've never had a woman City Hall reporter. And I said, well, I realize that, but I know I can do it. And they said, well, I don't know. Well, they lost their City Hall reporter, who was also their police reporter. You know, we did multiple things. And finally, they said to me, okay, we're going to give you a chance. We're going to put you on probation for 3 months. And I thought, okay. And so they had thrown the previous male reporter out of the mayor's office, and I got back into the mayor's office and was able to visit with him, etc. And I came back and I said, well, I'm back in the mayor's office. And of course, the city editor's first comment was, oh, did you sleep with him? Which kind of irritated me. Because no, I didn't need to do that. But anyway, I continued being on probation for 3 years. They never took me off probation. Now, I guess I did a pretty good job because nobody seemed to be too upset about it. But it was really interesting that no one ever actually said, oh yeah, you're the City Hall police reporter and you've done well. And, you know, after that, they opened the doors to women doing it. And then, of course, I brought up that I wanted to be the legislative reporter, and they said, well, we've never had a woman do that. So I switched to radio, where I became the legislative reporter.
Thank you. Well, we've got about another 10 minutes. Any closing remarks? Anything you'd like to share? Any story that I haven't touched on with a question? Sue, start, and we'll just go back down the other direction.
Well, you know, we get asked a lot about the women who are our mentors, and there were very, very many wonderful women, Edith Gaylord in particular. But let me tell you something. There were also some wonderful men. There were some men who said, you know what, we're overlooking the real potential here. Ed Gaylord was one of them. Jim Standard was another. I never felt like, especially once I got to Oklahoma, I never felt like the men were saying, you couldn't do this. You know, they were the ones who were saying, oh yeah, we get this. We're beginning to see how much potential you have. So I really think that it took both. In the 60s and 70s, it was some men who were very enlightened or really understood what hard news looked like, and also knew that there were some men reporters who couldn't handle it as well as a woman did. And, you know, one of the comments that was made when we were talking about in Topeka, when I wanted to be City Hall reporter, and they said, well, what if we have to send you to a suicide? And I said, well, I can handle that. And they said, well, the last woman we sent, she couldn't get out of the car. And I said, well, I think I could do that. And then I had one experience here when I was covering police, and they had sent another guy with me, and I couldn't find him. And I am standing literally on a body. You know, when you're focused, it's in a body bag, but you know, okay, I'm asking the police chief, where's the body? He said, you're standing on it. I said, oh, okay, sorry about that. But you know, I finally found him hiding in a doorway halfway down the block. I said, what are you doing? You're the police reporter. And he said, I can't handle this. Well, okay, some people are not cut out for that. So I really believe that it took both. It took both the terrific gals that blazed the way, and it took men who could see that, yeah, some of these gals are just pretty hard-nosed and really want to do it.
Thank you. Vivian?
I guess my comment would be that each generation stands on the shoulders of others, and I really feel like when you talk about us being pioneers, well, we're really not the pioneers. I think about Edith's generation, and I think about her friend Fran Lewin and Helen Thomas of UPI, and they had it really hard because they could not even cover newsmaking events. They were not allowed in the room to cover them, let alone all the things that we've been talking about, and they had to really be tough. They had to have a belief that they belonged there, and they had to fight to get in the room, had to fight to get the access to be able to cover things. And I really, Helen Thomas was the MC at my inaugural, and I think her and Edith's generation was just so instrumental. And I think about, you all were talking about lack of role models in broadcast at the time. When people say, well, what's changed for women, I think about my daughters-in-law and my soon-to-be daughter-in-law, and what's really changed for them is, I always knew I could do anything I set my mind to. I was an Oklahoman and, of pioneer stock and so forth. But when I started out, then most men in charge thought of women, their main relationships with women were as wives, mothers, girlfriends, sisters. They were personal relationships. Very few had serious colleague relationships with other women. And so you got all of these things we've been talking about. But now, that's just a different world for our sons and daughters, that men and women are colleagues together. They assume that. It's normal, it's natural, they've grown up that way. And I'm not saying that there aren't barriers now, but it makes a huge amount of difference that women today have seen other people succeed, know that they can do it, have an idea they can dream that they can do that. And I think that's the real big change, and that men as well know that, it's not only that men now have women as colleagues, but so many men are sharing in child rearing and family responsibilities. So many men and women are married who are both professional colleagues who are juggling it together seamlessly, and, well, no, not seamlessly, but juggling it together. And so that's just really a fundamentally different environment than what I certainly started out in.
I think your comment about men mentors was certainly on point. One of the persons most fair to me ever was when I was in high school, and because I lived in Midwest City and for other reasons, I switched to becoming a teen correspondent for the Oklahoma Journal. And John Klebs, who was one of the editors of the paper, he was wonderful to me. He was probably as good a person as anybody for whom I have ever worked in terms of fairness and pushing me forward. But it was a wonderful opportunity. He did sponsor me for the journal's entry into there was a UPIEO, United Press International Editors of Oklahoma, writing contest. And he told me the day in the newsroom, he liked my copy, he liked my story, but he said, "You're not going to win." He said, "They're not going to give it to a woman." And I got first runner-up, which that's okay. But anyway, I think your remark is very well taken. I think a lot of women, too, were unusually jealous, maybe, of some of the women coming along. The ones who were older, they weren't quite sure how to interpret these new people coming on the block. Some of the women maybe who had some of the power, they didn't want to lose it. They were just uncertain, perhaps, as to the possibilities, the roles. But you're right, some of the men were nicer to me than a lot of the women I've worked for. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I would have hated to have missed mentioning John Klebs' name. He is still alive, living in Midwest City. His son is the police chief, Brandon Klebs of Midwest City. But he was a tremendous person in my early life.
And I think that you all have touched on many of these things, but I think all of us would agree that we were in unusual circumstances that just happened to work out for us because, number one, we were prepared to step into those roles, and number two, the roles suddenly existed, exactly like you said. That's why I became the first female anchor at Channel 4, is because FCC was forcing television stations to put women on the air, which is why they approached it with kind of we don't know if this is going to work or not. But it also took guys who were open to this concept that women could do more than be mothers and spouses, which in its of itself is horribly important. But I can remember my son, when he was maybe 5 or 6 years old, because of our schedule, Will would teach in the morning at OU, and then he would come home and I'd leave for work from 2 to about 11. And so I was driving with my son Paul, who was about 5 or 6 at the time, and I said, well, Paul, what do you want to be when you grow up? And he said, I don't know. He said, I'm not very happy about being a guy. I said, well, why? And he said, because all you do is wash dishes and cook. I said, that's a different perspective. Thank your father.
Jennifer?
You raised him well.
You know, as I said, I really do feel that the pioneering was done before me, and I know you're saying you don't feel like pioneers, and by the time I was in the news business, there were lots and lots of women. So it was really more a matter of the same sorts of battles that women are fighting today, trying to define what does a woman anchor look like? What does she wear? Does she wear a man suit and short hair? You know, now they're all in little itty teeny short skirts. You know, remember Diane Sawyer got in trouble because she had a picture on the front of Vanity Fair trying to decide what it was. She had her shoulders bare. I don't know if you guys remember that. It was rather controversial. Katie Couric was showing too much leg. You know, now you've got Megyn Kelly posing in a slip. You know, I mean, so it's what does a woman journalist, what does a woman broadcaster look like, and how do we interface with men, and how do you know, my answer was to just be a hag. My sense was either you could be a doormat or a hag, and that was kind of what I saw. You either got run over or you got really, really, and I was overly harsh, but I wasn't going to be run over, and so. Learning how do you negotiate your way through without just beating people up. You know, what is, and I think Linda was always nicer than I am. I never heard any bad things about Linda, and I know she's probably heard things about me. I was really just hell on wheels in the newsroom, I'm just going to tell you. But I think there were those sorts of things. Try to negotiate, what does this look like? How do men and women work together? How do you be a full-time reporter and a mom? That I never anticipated that till it happened, and then I was like, whoa. How do you do this? And so there are those things that are still going on. But I will say this, that I was talking to Devin Green from the Gazette, who had done an interview with Sue to do the pre-publicity on this. And she said that Sue told her, and I'd never really thought about this, that when it came to gender in journalism, that Oklahoma was progressive before anybody even knew what the word meant. So I kind of pondered, why would that be? Why is honestly, since Jack Ogle, the quintessential anchor in this market, male or female, is Linda. And there's nobody with her stature, no man. In my adult lifetime, there's been no man with the stature that Linda has, and that's just how it is. And men have come, and her co-anchors have come and gone, but she has that stature. We had an editor of our state's largest paper that was a woman far ahead of most places. And I wondered, why is that? Well, I was doing my story for Discover Oklahoma on the Pioneer Woman Museum, where we have this, very correctly have this Women in Journalism exhibit. And I was looking at, just after I'd talked to Devin, and I was looking at that beautiful sculpture there. It's 17 feet tall, and it's this woman, if you've not seen it, it's just breathtaking. And she's got her son by the hand, and he's almost running to keep up with her, and she's in this big stride. And I started thinking about, in this state, so many of us, because we're such a young state, those days are hundreds of years behind in some states. But we all kind of remember, most of us have that matriarch, we remember, that prairie mom, and they did everything. You know, they could butcher a hog, and they could sew their own clothes, and they did little handwork, and they could educate their own kids. And so if you think about it, it's no wonder we had these male role models, and I had many of them too. Keith Sweezy would be one that comes to immediately to mind, who just had a sense that I could do anything, and there wasn't anything we couldn't do. And it's no wonder, because we've all known those women who did everything. You know, we have kind of that pioneer spirit. So it's so appropriate that the History Center has put this exhibit there in Ponca City at the Pioneer Woman Museum, because I really believe it has to do with who we are and where we came from, and the fact that our pioneer past is so close to us. And so, you know, men and women in this state know women can do anything, because, you know, our prairie matriarchs they did it all. So I'm just proud to be able to, stand on their shoulders, as has already been said here. So
thank you.
Thank you for including me.
Thank you for joining us today. You have informed us, not only today, but through your careers. You have inspired us to keep trying, to be better, to excel. And we appreciate you helping us with the exhibit, with this program today. the film on Edith Gaylord will continue to spread that message about one of those pioneers, and we look forward to working with you for many years to come. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's give them a round of applause.